The crystal chandelier above La Valora cast fractured light across polished marble as Jarrick Venaro raised a glass of Barolo to his lips, the wine's earthiness coating his tongue while his eyes swept the room with practiced vigilance. The restaurant hummed with Portland's elite, lawyers discussing acquisitions, tech executives celebrating mergers, women in silk dresses laughing at jokes that weren't funny. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Willamette River caught the amber glow of streetlights, turning the water into liquid bronze. Evening settled over the city like expensive perfume, wrapping steel bridges and green hills in a veil of approaching darkness. The piano player transitioned from Chopin to something modern, fingers dancing across ivory keys with the kind of precision that came from decades of practice. Waiters moved between tables like choreographed shadows, carrying plates of seared duck and truffle risotto, their movements synchronized to avoid collision. Jarrick's table occupied the corner, the power position where walls met glass, offering a clear view of both entrances while his back remained protected. His suit was charcoal gray, tailored in Milan, the fabric catching light differently than anything off a rack ever could. The air inside smelled of caramelized onions and aged balsamic, mingling with subtle notes of imported tobacco from the smoking lounge. Each gesture from the staff spoke of training that cost more than most people earned in months. The atmosphere carried weight, the kind that came from old money and older secrets. A crash near the kitchen doors shattered the carefully constructed ambiance, not of breaking dishes but of a body colliding with a hostess stand. Heads turned as a small figure burst through the entrance, her bare feet slapping against cold marble, her breathing ragged and desperate. The maitre d' reached for her shoulder, his face arranged in professional concern, but she twisted away with the desperation of prey evading capture. His polished smile cracked as she dodged his grasp, leaving him grasping at empty air. Maisy Winfell was 8 years old, her dark hair wild around a face flushed with exertion and terror. Her school uniform hung crooked, one knee sock missing, the other pulled around her ankle like a deflated balloon. She clutched a worn backpack to her chest, as if it contained something more valuable than textbooks. The restaurant staff converged, trying to intercept without causing a scene, their hands reaching but never quite touching as she darted between tables. A woman in pearls gasped, pulling her purse closer as if childhood panic might be contagious. The piano player's hands stilled mid-phrase, leaving a melody hanging unfinished in air suddenly thick with collective discomfort. Conversations died in clusters, spreading silence like falling dominoes across the elegant space. Jarrick set down his wine, the base of the glass meeting marble with barely a whisper, his expression unchanged but his attention sharpening like a blade finding its edge. The girl moved toward him with the precision of someone who'd made a deliberate choice, not random flight. Her trajectory cut through the restaurant's carefully constructed order like a stone through still water, ripples of disruption spreading outward from her path. The security detail stationed near the bar shifted position, hands moving toward concealed weapons. She stopped at his table, her small hands gripping the edge of the white linen cloth, leaving damp prints against fabric that cost more than most people's weekly salary. Her chest heaved with exertion, sweat beading at her temples, eyes wide with something beyond simple fear. Jarrick's men moved to intercept, but he raised one finger, a gesture so small it barely qualified as movement, yet it froze them mid-step. The girl's eyes locked onto his with an intensity that didn't belong in someone so young, desperation carved into every line of her face. She opened her mouth, struggling to form words through gasping breaths, her vocal cords fighting against the panic that threatened to strangle them. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath, waiting for whatever would come next. "He's coming," she whispered, the words barely audible yet carrying across the silent room like a gunshot through fog. 3 syllables that changed the temperature of the air, that transformed expensive ambiance into something cold and sharp. Jarrick's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a calculation happening at speeds most people couldn't comprehend. He studied the girl's face with the focus of someone reading a contract where every word mattered, where missing a single detail could prove fatal. The silence following Maisy's words stretched like pulled taffy, growing thinner and more fragile with each passing second. Jarrick leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in a posture that suggested contemplation rather than alarm. Around them, the restaurant's patrons pretended not to watch while doing exactly that, their conversations resuming in hushed tones that couldn't quite mask their curiosity. Silverware clinked against porcelain with exaggerated normalcy, each sound ringing false in the tension-thick atmosphere. The girl's knuckles whitened against the tablecloth, her entire body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline that hadn't yet burned through her system. A bead of sweat traced down her temple, disappearing into the collar of her rumpled uniform. Jarrick's security chief, a mountain of a man named Cade, approached from the left, his expression carefully neutral, but his hand positioned near his jacket. He stopped 3 feet away, awaiting orders that hadn't been given, reading his employer's body language like scripture. "How far behind you?" Jarrick's voice was quiet, pitched for her ears alone, carrying none of the alarm another man might have shown. His tone suggested he was asking about weather patterns rather than imminent threats, but his eyes never stopped moving, cataloging exits and angles. Maisy's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before words emerged, raw and scraped. "I ran from school. 10 blocks, maybe." I didn't look back after Broadway. The detail spoke volumes. She'd maintained enough awareness during panic to track distance, to remember street names, to function while terror clawed at her throat. Jarrick's estimation of her shifted, recalibrating to account for intelligence that exceeded her years. His hand moved to the table, fingers drumming once against the marble in a pattern his men would recognize. 2 waiters immediately altered their positions, moving toward the entrance with trays that suddenly seemed less important than their new vantage points. "Why me?" The question came without accusation, simple curiosity wrapped in careful enunciation. Most people running from danger didn't sprint toward Portland's most dangerous man, unless desperation had eliminated all other options. Maisy's eyes darted toward the entrance, then back to his face, making a decision that clearly terrified her almost as much as whatever pursued her. "My mom cleans houses on Hawthorne. Mrs. Chen talks about you. Says you're scary but fair." The reference to his housekeeper's gossip network almost pulled a smile from him, but he kept his expression carved from granite. Information traveled through invisible channels in this city, and apparently his reputation reached even the children of cleaning staff. "Fair is debatable," he said, his voice carrying a hint of something that might have been dark humor in another context. "But scary works in your favor right now." The front door opened, triggering a soft chime that normally blended into background noise, but now cut through the room like a blade. Every head turned toward the entrance with varying degrees of subtlety, curiosity warring with self-preservation instincts. A man stepped through, tall, well-dressed in a charcoal suit that almost matched Jarrick's in quality, his posture carrying the kind of confidence that came from authority rarely questioned. His hair was silver at the temples, distinguished rather than aged, his smile practiced and professionally warm. He paused just inside the threshold, eyes adjusting to the amber lighting, scanning the room with the methodical patience of someone accustomed to finding what they sought. His gaze skipped over tables like stones across water, until it landed on Maisy's small form. Something flickered across his face, relief mixed with irritation, quickly smoothed into concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. He started forward, his stride measured and unhurried, broadcasting calm authority with every step. Maisy's entire body went rigid, her breathing accelerating into something close to hyperventilation, small sounds escaping her throat that she couldn't quite suppress. Her fingers released the tablecloth only to grab Jarrick's sleeve, twisting expensive fabric with desperate strength. The gesture spoke louder than any words could. This wasn't fear of punishment for running away, or anxiety about parental disappointment. This was primal terror, the kind that lived in bone marrow and bypassed rational thought entirely. The approaching man's shoes clicked against marble with metronomic precision, each step measured to project authority without aggression. His smile widened as he drew closer, revealing teeth too white to be natural, the kind of perfection that cost thousands, and looked slightly wrong in candlelight. "There you are, Maisy," his voice carried across the remaining distance, warm and relieved, pitched perfectly for an audience that pretended not to listen. "We've been so worried. Your teacher called when you ran off during dismissal." His hand extended toward her in a gesture meant to appear paternal, fingers spread in invitation rather than demand. The sleeve of his suit pulled back slightly, revealing a watch that caught the light, expensive but not ostentatious, chosen by someone who understood subtle displays of wealth. Jarrick's eyes tracked the movement with the focus of a hunter, assessing potential threat, noting details most people would miss. The man's gait favored his left leg almost imperceptibly. His right hand moved more freely than his left, and his smile never reached the muscles around his eyes. "I'm Kent Ashford, student counselor at St. Cecilia Academy," the man continued, directing his words toward Jarrick now, with the assumption of adult solidarity. "I apologize for the disruption, Maisy has been struggling with some behavioral challenges lately. The phrase behavioral challenges landed in the space between them like a chess piece being positioned, attempting to frame the narrative before alternative interpretations could take root. His tone suggested patience worn thin, professional concern masking exasperation with a difficult child. Maisy's grip on Jarrick's sleeve tightened until her knuckles went bone white, her whole body pressing backward as if she could phase through the chair and disappear. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged, fear strangling whatever words she wanted to speak. "She's mentioned you?" Jarrick's question came quiet and level, directed at the girl rather than Ashford, his attention never fully leaving the man who claimed authority over her. The query held no skepticism, just simple request for confirmation. The girl's head shook frantically, hair whipping across her face, finally finding her voice in a whisper that barely qualified as sound. "Never seen him at school. Not in the office, not in hallways." Ashford's smile flickered, a momentary crack in professional polish before reconstructing itself into understanding patience. "I work primarily with the upper grades, 6th through 8th, so younger students wouldn't necessarily recognize me." The explanation came too quickly, too smoothly, rehearsed in the way of lies told often enough to sound like truth. His weight shifted almost imperceptibly, readjusting his stance in a way that suggested preparation for resistance he hadn't expected to encounter. "Sarah," Maisy's voice cut through the tension, stronger now, fueled by something beyond fear, the desperation of someone who knew this might be her only chance to speak. "Sarah Kemper from 4th grade. She disappeared 3 weeks ago." The name dropped into conversation like a stone into still water, ripples spreading outward in waves of implication. Ashford's expression shifted through several configurations. Surprise, confusion, concern, cycling through appropriate reactions like someone flipping through a catalog of expressions. "Sarah transferred to a different school," he said, his tone gentle but firm, the voice of an adult correcting a child's misunderstanding. "Her family moved to Seattle. I processed the paperwork myself." But Maisy was shaking her head before he finished speaking, words tumbling out faster now as if a dam had broken. "Her backpack, the purple one with the cat pins. I saw it in your car last Tuesday in the parking lot." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore or disperse, changing the molecular structure of every breath drawn in the restaurant. Ashford's face arranged itself into benign confusion, but something shifted behind his eyes, a calculation happening at speeds that betrayed genuine alarm. "You must be mistaken, sweetheart." The endearment dripped with condescension wrapped in synthetic warmth, his hand still extended toward her, an invitation that had become insistence. "I don't even know which car you're referring to. The faculty lot has over 30 vehicles." Jarrick's glass returned to the table with deliberate slowness, the base meeting marble with a soft click that somehow carried more weight than any shout could have. The sound acted like a signal, shifting something fundamental in the room's power structure without a single word being spoken. His men materialized from positions throughout the restaurant, not rushing or drawing weapons, simply repositioning with the coordinated precision of pieces moving across a chessboard. They created a loose perimeter that appeared casual, but effectively cut off direct paths to the exit. "The silver Lexus," Maisy continued, her voice gaining strength from Jarrick's silent support, from the presence of men who'd stopped pretending this was a private matter. "License plate starts with KXT. I memorized it because something felt wrong." Ashford's professional mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing something cold and calculating beneath the veneer of concerned authority. His hand lowered slowly, no longer extended in invitation, but curling into a loose fist at his side. The restaurant's ambient noise seemed to fade, conversations dying as patrons sensed the shift in atmospheric pressure. "That's quite an imagination," he said, forcing a chuckle that sounded like gravel scraping glass, his eyes darting toward the exit, then back to Jarrick. "Children often confuse details, see things that aren't there, especially when they're upset." Jarrick's fingers drummed once against the tablecloth, a rhythm that Cade recognized immediately, prompting him to produce a phone from his inner pocket. The security chief's thumbs moved across the screen with practiced efficiency, accessing databases that weren't meant for civilian eyes. Maisy's breathing had steadied now, drawing courage from the invisible fortress forming around her, from men who asked no questions, but took her seriously. Sarah's lunchbox was there too, the yellow one with princess stickers her grandma gave her for Christmas. The specificity of detail painted pictures that couldn't be unseen, each concrete image adding weight to accusations that grew heavier with every word. Ashford's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a muscle jumping beneath skin that had gone slightly pale under the amber lighting. "I think we should discuss this privately," Ashford suggested, his voice taking on an edge that cut through the pretense of gentle concern. "Perhaps outside, or in my vehicle where we won't disturb these nice people's dinner." The suggestion landed with all the subtlety of a threat wrapped in reasonable suggestion, the kind of statement that revealed more than it concealed. Jarrick's eyes narrowed fractionally, reading subtext in the spaces between words, where truth often hid from direct light. "She stays here." Jarrick's voice carried no room for negotiation, each word chiseled from granite and delivered with quiet finality. "But you're welcome to explain why an upper-grade counselor would have a fourth grader's belongings in his personal vehicle." Ashford's smile had completely disappeared now, replaced by a hardness that transformed his distinguished features into something closer to his true nature. His posture shifted, weight redistributing in preparation for fight or flight, instincts overriding training that insisted on maintaining civilian disguise. "There's a misunderstanding here," he tried again, but his voice had lost its warm coating, revealing the metal underneath. "I'm simply trying to help a troubled child. Her mother works 3 jobs, barely supervises her." The deflection attempted to shift focus toward Maisy's home situation, painting a picture of neglect that might explain wild accusations. But Jarrick had grown up reading people the way scholars read ancient texts, finding meaning in what wasn't said as much as what was. Cade moved closer, phone screen angled toward Jarrick's line of sight, displaying information that made something dangerous flash through the older man's eyes. Vehicle registration records showed ownership details that didn't match the story being spun across expensive marble. "St. Cecilia Academy has no Kent Ashford on staff," Jarrick said, his voice dropping lower, each word weighted with implications that pressed down like atmospheric pressure before a storm. "Their counselor is a woman named Patricia Hemmings, has been for 6 years. The statement detonated in the space between them, exposing lies that could no longer hide behind professional credentials and practiced smiles. Ashford's face went through rapid calculations, weighing options that were evaporating faster than morning fog under direct sunlight. "There are multiple counselors," he attempted, but the protest came weak and desperate, lacking the conviction that gave lies their power. His eyes tracked the positions of Jarrick's men, counting exits that had become significantly less accessible. Maisy's voice cut through again, stronger now, finding power in being believed for perhaps the first time since terror had entered her world. "He watches us during recess, stands by the fence on Tuesdays and Thursdays, always alone, always staring." The detail painted a picture that made several restaurant patrons shift uncomfortably in their seats, maternal instincts and protective urges responding to implications they couldn't ignore. A woman 2 tables away pulled out her phone, fingers hovering over numbers that could summon different kinds of authority. "Sarah told me a man gave her small gifts by the gate," Maisy continued, words flowing faster now as if a pressure valve had finally released. "Said he knew her mom, that he could give her rides home when it got dark early." Each revelation built upon the last, constructing a narrative that grew more damning with every specific detail, every concrete memory that couldn't be dismissed as childish confusion. Ashford's breathing had become slightly labored, trapped animal recognizing its cage was closing. "She showed me the candy, fancy chocolate in gold wrappers, not the kind from stores." The girl's hands twisted together, remembering details that had seemed strange then, but terrifying now in retrospect. Jarrick stood slowly, the movement fluid and controlled, his height suddenly apparent as he unfolded from the chair like a blade being drawn. The restaurant fell completely silent now, all pretense of disinterest abandoned as every eye tracked the confrontation that had escalated beyond diplomatic resolution. "Cade," he said quietly, the name carrying instructions that didn't need elaboration. Years of working together eliminating the need for verbose commands. The security chief moved to block Ashford's most direct path to the door, his bulk positioned with casual efficiency. Ashford's hand moved toward his pocket in a gesture that could have been innocent, but triggered immediate response from 3 different positions. Hands appeared on weapons that remained concealed, creating a web of potential violence that hung suspended in breathable air. "Easy," Jarrick's voice cut through the tension like a conductor's baton, maintaining control through sheer force of presence rather than volume. "Let's not make this messier than necessary. There are civilians present who've done nothing to deserve that kind of memory." The consideration for bystander trauma spoke to calculation rather than compassion, protecting assets and reputation by avoiding spectacle that might involve police reports. Ashford's hand froze, then slowly emerged empty, palms spreading in surrender that came too late to be convincing. "I want to speak to my lawyer," Ashford said, finally abandoning his character completely, his voice stripped of warmth and revealing the cold pragmatism underneath. "I know my rights. You can't hold me here against my will." The appeal to legal protection would have carried more weight if he'd maintained his cover story, but abandoning the counselor pretense had undermined claims to innocence. Jarrick's slight smile held no humor, just acknowledgement of an opponent making tactical errors under pressure. "No one's holding you," Jarrick replied, his tone reasonable, even as his men tightened their perimeter with movements subtle as breathing. "But, before you leave, perhaps you'd like to explain why a simple misunderstanding requires legal representation." The logical trap closed around Ashford like fingers around a throat, each word tightening the noose constructed from his own responses. Sweat beaded at his temples despite the restaurant's careful climate control, biological responses betraying what polished exterior tried to conceal. Cade's phone buzzed softly, new information arriving through channels that operated in Portland's shadows, connecting dots that official systems moved too slowly to map. He glanced at the screen, then at Jarrick, his expression darkening in ways that suggested discoveries worse than anticipated. 3 priors in different states, Cade murmured, voice pitched for Jarrick's ears alone, but carrying far enough for Ashford to know his past was no longer buried. Registry lists him under a different name. Kent Ashford is alias number 4. The information transformed speculation into confirmation, theory into documented fact, changing the nature of everything that had preceded it. Maisy pressed closer to Jarrick's chair, vindication mixing with terror in her expression, relief at being believed warring with horror at being right. Ashford's face had gone from pale to gray, the color of someone watching carefully constructed walls crumble into rubble around their feet. His eyes darted toward windows, calculating distances and angles with the desperate mathematics of someone running out of options. "The silver Lexus is registered to a shell company in Beaverton," Cade continued, each fact another nail in a coffin being constructed in real time. "Same company owns a property out past Gresham. Rural area. No close neighbors." The implications hung heavy as wet canvas, painting pictures no one wanted to visualize but couldn't ignore once suggested. The woman who'd been reaching for her phone earlier completed the motion, fingers flying across the screen to summon authorities equipped for this kind of darkness. Jarrick's hand rested briefly on Maisy's shoulder, a gesture so slight it barely qualified as contact, but carrying reassurance that made her breathing slow toward normal. "You did the right thing," he said quietly, speaking to her rather than the man whose world was collapsing. Staying silent would have been easier, but easier isn't always right. The statement carried weight beyond immediate circumstance, offering philosophy wrapped in concrete validation, teaching lessons about courage while acknowledging its cost. Maisy's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back, finally safe enough to let them fall. Ashford lunged then, not toward the door but toward Maisy, desperation overriding whatever calculation had kept him superficially calm. His movement was fast but not fast enough, reflexes honed by legitimate panic no match for men trained in varieties of violence. Cade intercepted him 2 feet from Jarrick's table, one massive hand closing around Ashford's wrist with sufficient force to stop momentum without breaking bones. The security chief's other hand pressed against Ashford's chest, creating immovable barrier between the man and intended victim. "Poor choice," Cade said mildly, his voice conversational, despite the violence implicit in his grip. The kind of restraint that suggested far worse consequences were being generously withheld. Ashford struggled briefly, then went still, recognizing futility when confronted by superior force. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second, summoning official authority to handle what had begun as private matter. Jarrick's expression showed neither satisfaction nor concern, merely acceptance of inevitable intersection between his world and theirs. 2 systems colliding over shared interest in justice. The restaurant's manager appeared from the back office, his face pale with understanding that his establishment had become crime scene, that tomorrow's headlines would mention La Valora in contexts he'd spent years avoiding. Jarrick caught his eye and nodded once, a gesture that promised compensation for disruption and discretion about certain details. Ashford had stopped struggling in Cade's grip, his body going slack with defeat or calculation, weighing whether cooperation might salvage anything from wreckage. His eyes tracked the approaching sirens with expression that cycled between fear and something harder to identify, resignation mixed with defiance that suggested he wasn't working alone. "How many?" Jarrick's question came soft and deadly serious, pitched only for Ashford's ears, despite the audience that had abandoned all pretense of not listening. How many families before Sarah's, before Maisy almost became a name on your list? The question demanded accounting that legal systems would take months to extract through formal channels, offering chance for confession that might carry weight in calculations yet to come. Ashford's jaw clenched, muscle jumping beneath skin gone sallow under lights that suddenly seemed too bright. Police vehicles pulled up outside, blue and red lights painting the restaurant's windows in alternating colors that transformed elegant ambiance into something closer to nightmare aesthetic. Officers emerged with hands on weapons, responding to calls that had described potential violence and child endangerment. Cade maintained his grip but shifted position, allowing law enforcement clear sight lines while protecting against last-second desperation moves. His expression remained professionally neutral, someone accustomed to standing at the intersection of legal and extra-legal authority without confusion about which served which purpose. The lead officer entered with weapon drawn but lowered, assessing scene that had been contained before their arrival, recognizing faces that complicated simple narratives about heroes and villains. Her name tag read, Morrison, and her eyes carried the weariness of someone who'd worked Portland's streets long enough to understand its layered realities. Mr. Venaro, she acknowledged him with nod that carried neither respect nor hostility, just recognition of mutual existence in overlapping spheres. Her attention shifted to Ashford, taking in his restrained position and guilty body language with practiced assessment. "This is Kent Ashford, or whatever his real name is," Jarrick said, his voice carrying courtroom clarity despite informal setting, providing information that would streamline processes designed to be deliberately slow. "The girl can provide details about his activities near St. Cecilia Academy." Morrison's expression hardened as she absorbed implications, maternal fury breaking through professional detachment for just a moment before discipline reasserted control. She gestured to her partners, who moved forward with handcuffs and Miranda warnings, reciting constitutional protections to someone who'd denied them to others. "We'll need statements from everyone," Morrison said, her gaze sweeping the restaurant's patrons who'd witnessed the confrontation, who'd become unwilling participants in something larger than interrupted dinner service. Particularly the child. Maisy pressed against Jarrick's chair, not ready to transfer trust to new authority figures despite their uniforms and promises of protection. Her fingers found his sleeve again, holding fabric like lifeline, seeking reassurance that she wouldn't be abandoned to systems that might not understand or believe. "She stays with me until her mother arrives," Jarrick stated, not requesting permission but establishing terms that left room for negotiation only on implementation details. "My lawyer will accompany her during any formal interviews. She's 8 and terrified, and has already shown more courage than most adults manage." Morrison's eyes narrowed slightly, weighing jurisdictional authority against practical reality, recognizing battles worth fighting versus those better conceded for larger strategic purposes. She nodded slowly, accepting terms that protected the child while maintaining investigative integrity. Ashford was being led toward the exit in handcuffs when Maisy's voice rang out again, clear and certain, despite tears still drying on her cheeks. "Check the property in Gresham. He took pictures on his phone. I saw them in the parking lot." The detail stopped Morrison mid-step, professional antenna quivering at information that suggested evidence beyond testimonial accounts, concrete proof that might bypass reasonable doubt. She turned back to the girl, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time, not as victim requiring gentle handling, but as witness with crucial intelligence. "What kind of pictures?" Morrison asked, crouching to Maisy's eye level, her voice gentle but urgent, understanding that details provided now might prevent delays that could mean life or death. Her hand hovered near the girl's, but didn't make contact, respecting boundaries trauma had made necessary. A basement, concrete walls with heavy locks on the outside. Maisy's voice wavered, but held steady, forcing out words that clearly cost her to speak. "And a reinforced room, the kind meant to keep sound from escaping, white and industrial looking." The description painted horrors that made Morrison's jaw clench, that transformed routine arrest into potential rescue mission requiring immediate action. She stood abruptly, gesturing her partners toward vehicles while pulling radio from her belt with practiced urgency. "I need search warrants for property matching this description in Gresham area." She spoke into the radio with crisp authority, no longer bothering to mask the nature of the emergency from civilian ears. "Possible kidnapping victim on premises. This is time critical." Squad cars peeled away from La Valora with sirens screaming, their urgency painting the night in strobing colors that reflected off the Willamette's dark surface. Inside the restaurant, The remaining officers began the methodical work of collecting statements, transforming elegant dining space into temporary headquarters for an investigation that was expanding by the minute. Jarrick's phone buzzed with incoming messages from contacts throughout the city, his network awakening like a nervous system responding to stimulus. Information flowed through channels that existed parallel to official systems, faster and often more accurate than anything badges and warrants could access. His fingers moved across the screen, directing resources toward the Gresham property with efficiency born from years of operating in shadows. Maisy sat in a chair someone had brought from the kitchen, too large for her small frame, making her look even younger than her 8 years. A waiter had provided her with hot chocolate she hadn't touched, the steam rising in spirals that caught the light. Her eyes remained fixed on the door through which they'd taken Ashford, as if watching could ensure he stayed gone. Morrison finished conferring with her team and approached Jarrick's table again, her expression carrying the complicated mathematics of someone weighing jurisdictional authority against practical necessity. She pulled out a chair without asking permission, sitting with posture that suggested this conversation would happen regardless of his preferences. "Your information network is impressive," she said, her tone carefully neutral, acknowledging reality without endorsing it, walking the diplomatic tightrope that kept Portland's power structures from open warfare. "The property records you provided will save us hours, maybe save a life if we're lucky." Jarrick inclined his head fractionally, accepting the observation without confirming or denying the mechanisms behind it, maintaining plausible deniability that served both their interests. His eyes remained on Maisy, ensuring she stayed within protective radius, even while attention divided across multiple concerns. "The girl's mother, Lucina Winfell, works for a cleaning service that operates downtown," Morrison continued, consulting notes on her phone with practiced efficiency. "We've contacted her employer. Should have her here within 30 minutes. The name settled into Jarrick's memory with unexpected weight, filing itself in categories usually reserved for more significant players in his world. Something about the situation had shifted from obligation to personal investment, though he couldn't have articulated exactly when the transformation occurred. "She'll want to take Maisy home," Morrison added, her voice carrying understanding of parental instincts that would override any official requests for extended cooperation. "But we'll need follow-up interviews once she's had time to process. Children often remember additional details after the immediate crisis passes." Jarrick nodded, already calculating logistics of protection that extended beyond tonight's intervention, recognizing that placing a target on Hunter's back sometimes painted targets on those who'd exposed him. His organization excelled at many things, and making problems disappear, whether human or procedural, ranked high among their specialties. Cade reappeared from wherever he'd vanished during the arrest, his expression carrying information he'd chosen not to share over phone lines that might be monitored. He leaned close to Jarrick's ear, voice dropping below threshold of casual eavesdropping despite surrounding chaos. "The Gresham property has 2 registered owners, Ashford and someone named Philip Thorne," Cade murmured, each word chosen for precision rather than speed. "Thorne has connections to 3 other individuals with records similar to Ashford's. This isn't a lone operator situation." Jarrick's mind shifted into strategic mode, calculating moves and countermoves with the precision of someone who'd spent years anticipating threats before they materialized. Individual hunters could be eliminated, but networks required surgical dismantling that left no room for survivors to rebuild what had been destroyed. His fingers drummed once against the table, pattern that Cade recognized as authorization to proceed beyond legal boundaries if necessary. The radio transmission continued in bursts of static-laced urgency, teams coordinating across the property as they documented evidence that would fill storage rooms. Each discovery painted pictures of systematic operation rather than opportunistic crime, suggesting infrastructure built over years rather than months. Morrison's expression grew harder with each update, professional detachment eroding under weight of horrors her team was uncovering. "Second vehicle on property, white panel van with modified interior and soundproofing," another voice crackled through the radio, clinical description that couldn't mask the implications. "Oregon plates but registered to same shell company," along with residences in 3 adjacent states forming a triangle pattern. The geographic distribution suggested deliberate strategy, operational territory spanning regions where jurisdictional boundaries complicated investigation and prosecution. Jarrick filed the information alongside other details, his network already moving to fill gaps that legal systems would take weeks to address, ensuring that accomplices found nowhere to hide while authorities assembled their cases. The revelation transformed isolated incident into systemic problem, suggesting organizational structure rather than individual pathology, networks that required coordinated dismantling rather than single arrest. Jarrick's jaw tightened imperceptibly, the only visible sign of fury that burned cold and controlled beneath his composed exterior. Morrison's radio crackled to life, voices overlapping in excitement and horror, as the Gresham raid produced results nobody had dared hope for, yet everyone had dreaded. "We have a survivor. Repeat, we have a living victim on site. Female child, approximately 9 years old, responsive but needs immediate medical attention." The announcement rippled through the restaurant like electricity through water, tension breaking into relief so profound it bordered on physical sensation. Maisy's head snapped up, hope and terror warring across her face as she processed implications of what she'd set in motion. "Sarah?" The name emerged as question and prayer combined. Desperate plea wrapped in barely contained hope, the kind that hurt because caring made vulnerability inevitable. Her small hands gripped the chair's arms with white-knuckled intensity, entire body leaning forward as if proximity might bring clearer answers. Morrison pressed the radio to her ear, filtering signal from static, extracting details from overlapping transmissions that competed for priority in crowded airwaves. Her expression cycled through professional detachment into something rawer, more human, before control reasserted itself with visible effort. "Sarah Kemper has been recovered alive," Morrison confirmed, her voice thick with emotion she didn't bother hiding, understanding that some victories demanded acknowledgement beyond clinical reporting. "She's dehydrated and traumatized but conscious, asking for her mother and talking about a girl who was kind to her at school." Maisy burst into tears then, not from fear, but from relief so intense it overwhelmed her capacity for containment, sobs racking her small frame with force that seemed too large for her body. Jarrick's hand found her shoulder again, steady pressure that anchored her through the storm of emotions no 8-year-old should have to navigate. "You saved her life," he said quietly, stating fact rather than offering platitude, giving her truth when comfort would have cheapened what she'd accomplished. "Your courage and your memory, those are the only reasons Sarah's coming home tonight." The words sank into her like seeds into soil, planting something that might grow into pride once terror's shadow receded enough to allow other emotions room to breathe. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving smudges across her cheeks that made her look even more childlike, despite the adult burdens she'd carried. Lucina Winfell arrived in a rush of winter air, and panic barely contained, her cleaning service uniform still bearing traces of polish and dust from houses that belonged to people whose biggest concerns didn't involve missing children. She was younger than Jarrick expected, early 30s at most, with Maisy's dark hair and the kind of exhaustion that lived in bone marrow rather than just muscles. Her eyes found her daughter across the restaurant with the precision of maternal radar that needed no directions, no explanations, just instinct that connected them across space and circumstance. She crossed the distance at near run, dropping to her knees beside Maisy's chair with grace that suggested years of physical labor had kept her body strong despite endless fatigue. "Baby," the word emerged choked and desperate, hands framing Maisy's face to verify wholeness, searching for injuries both physical and otherwise with touch that cataloged every detail. "What happened? They said you were in danger, that there was a man." Maisy launched into explanation that tumbled out in fragments, trauma making linear narrative impossible, jumping between moments with the chaos of someone who'd survived rather than merely witnessed. Lucina listened with expression that cycled through disbelief, into horror, into pride so fierce it bordered on painful to observe. Morrison approached carefully, recognizing sacred space when she saw it, giving them 30 seconds of reunion before duty demanded intrusion. She crouched beside them both, her presence apologetic but necessary, carrying the weight of systems that processed tragedy through paperwork and protocols. "Ms. Winfell, I'm Detective Morrison," she began, her voice gentle but professional, walking the line between compassion and investigation. "Your daughter potentially saved multiple lives tonight. Her courage and observational skills helped us recover a kidnapping victim and arrest a dangerous individual." Lucina's arms tightened around Maisy, protective instinct responding to confirmation that her daughter had been exposed to darkness no parent wanted their child to recognize. Her eyes lifted to Morrison's face, searching for reassurance that the danger had passed rather than just paused. "Is she safe now?" The question carried every parent's deepest fear, the knowledge that some threats couldn't be eliminated completely, only managed and monitored and hoped against. Her voice cracked slightly on the final word, betraying exhaustion that went deeper than tonight's crisis. "The immediate threat is contained," Morrison assured her, choosing words carefully to convey truth without sugarcoating reality that included accomplices still unidentified. "We'll maintain patrol presence in your neighborhood and provide resources for security upgrades if needed." Lucina's attention shifted then, following Maisy's gaze toward the corner table where Jarrick remained seated, observing the reunion with expression that revealed nothing of whatever calculations occupied his mind. Recognition flickered across her face, not of personal acquaintance but of reputation, understanding who he was and what that meant. Maisy tugged on her mother's sleeve, urgency in the gesture that transcended verbal communication, conveying necessity of something she couldn't quite articulate but felt with absolute certainty. Her eyes moved between Lucina and Jarrick, with expectation that adults would understand what children perceived instinctively about debts that required acknowledgement. The girl had learned tonight that danger could wear professional smiles, but also that protection sometimes came from unexpected sources wrapped in expensive suits. Morrison observed the exchange with interest that exceeded professional curiosity, recognizing dynamics that spoke to Portland's complex social architecture, where official power and shadow authority existed in careful balance. She'd worked this city long enough to understand that some problems required solutions that operated outside her jurisdiction, that justice sometimes wore faces courts didn't recognize. Her hand rested briefly on her radio, but she made no move to interrupt, accepting that some conversations served law enforcement's interests, even when they occurred beyond its direct oversight. The restaurant had begun emptying as patrons completed statements and fled toward normalcy, eager to distance themselves from evening that had transformed dinner into testimony. Tables sat abandoned mid-meal, expensive food congealing on plates that waitstaff cleared with expressions mixing relief and residual shock. Only Jarrick's section remained untouched, island of calm surrounded by evidence of chaos that had temporarily shattered the establishment's carefully constructed atmosphere. Cade had positioned himself near the entrance, his bulk blocking casual observation from street level, ensuring that whatever conversation unfolded between his employer and the cleaning woman occurred without audience beyond those already invested. His eyes tracked movement outside with vigilance that never ceased, understanding that networks meant accomplices potentially aware their colleague had been compromised, that retaliation might come swift if it came at all. She stood slowly, helping Maisy to her feet with hands that trembled slightly despite efforts at control, maternal courage overriding instincts that suggested approaching Portland's most dangerous man might not be wise. Her spine straightened with dignity that transcended circumstances, pride that poverty and exhaustion hadn't managed to erase. Jarrick watched her approach with interest that exceeded professional courtesy, cataloging details his mind filed under categories he rarely accessed. She moved with grace despite work boots and uniform that smelled of cleaning chemicals, carrying herself with quiet strength that expensive clothes couldn't buy or counterfeit. "Mr. Venaro," she began, his name emerging with careful pronunciation that suggested she'd heard it spoken but never used it directly, understanding the weight it carried in certain contexts. "I don't have words adequate for... My daughter says you protected her when she had nowhere else to run." Her voice caught slightly on the phrase "nowhere else," acknowledging failure of systems meant to keep children safe, admission that mothers working 3 jobs couldn't provide surveillance cameras and security details. Her hands twisted together, nervous gesture at odds with the steadiness of her gaze. "She made a brave choice," Jarrick replied, his tone carrying none of the dismissiveness another man might have used, treating her gratitude as worthy of serious response rather than polite deflection. "Not many adults would have her clarity under pressure. You've raised someone remarkable." The compliment landed with unexpected weight, recognition that single mothers exhausted from survival often missed hearing, validation of sacrifices made in darkness that nobody witnessed or applauded. Lucina's eyes filled with tears. She blinked back rapidly, maintaining composure through sheer force of will. "I work for Pine Valley Cleaning. We service some properties in your neighborhood," she said, establishing connection that explained how Mrs. Chen's gossip had reached Maisy's ears, information traveling through invisible networks of domestic workers. "If there's ever anything I can do to repay what you've done tonight," Jarrick raised one hand slightly, gesture that stopped her mid-sentence without rudeness, conveying messages in movement that required no verbal elaboration. His eyes held hers with intensity that made the crowded restaurant fade into irrelevance, creating bubble of privacy through sheer force of focused attention. "Your daughter's safety is sufficient payment," he said quietly, words carrying finality that foreclosed negotiation while simultaneously opening possibilities neither acknowledged directly. Though I'd appreciate knowing you both get home securely, Portland can be unpredictable after dark. The offer came wrapped in concern that could have been simple courtesy, but carried undertones of something more complex. Protection extended beyond immediate crisis, interest that exceeded philanthropic obligation. Lucina recognized the subtext, even if she couldn't have articulated exactly what was being communicated beneath surface conversation. 3 weeks passed before the full scope of what Maisy's courage had exposed became public knowledge, investigation expanding like ripples from stone thrown in still water. The Gresham property yielded evidence linking 17 individuals across 4 states, digital files that documented horrors. Prosecutors would spend months cataloging for trials that would dominate headlines. Sarah Kemper returned to school after 2 weeks of hospitalization and therapy, still fragile but healing in ways that wouldn't show on medical charts. She found Maisy during recess on her first day back, wordless embrace communicating gratitude that language couldn't adequately express. They'd become inseparable since, friendship forged in circumstances that bound them more tightly than any ordinary childhood connection. 23 children total had been identified as potential or actual victims. Rescue operations coordinated across state lines, producing recoveries that made national news. Federal agencies had taken over prosecution of the network, dismantling infrastructure that had operated for nearly a decade beneath society's notice. Jarrick's role in initiating the investigation remained largely unreported, his preference for shadows serving both personal interests and strategic purposes. Official statements credited anonymous tips and vigilant law enforcement, carefully constructed narratives that omitted inconvenient details about who'd really connected the dots first. La Valora had returned to normal operations, though certain tables remained unofficially reserved. Certain clients now received attention that transcended excellent service into something closer to protective oversight. The staff had been generously compensated for trauma and inconvenience, bonuses that ensured loyalty and discretion in equal measure. Lucina had received an envelope 3 days after that night, delivered to her apartment by messenger who'd vanished before she could ask questions. Inside was cash, enough to cover 3 months of rent and security deposits on a better place, and a business card with a single phone number, no name attached. She hadn't called the number yet, pride warring with pragmatism, understanding that accepting help from Jarrick Venaro came with implications she wasn't sure she was ready to navigate. But she'd kept the card, tucked into her wallet where it pressed against her driver's license like a talisman, or a promise, or possibly both. Maisy had nightmares still, waking, gasping from dreams where silver Lexuses chased her down endless streets, where basements opened beneath her feet, revealing darkness that swallowed sound and hope. But Lucina held her through them, whispering assurances that monsters caught couldn't hurt her anymore, that bravery meant being scared and acting anyway. Morrison had stopped by their new apartment twice under pretense of follow-up questions, really checking that they'd settled safely, that protection services were being delivered as promised. She'd brought coloring books the first time, forensic psychology disguised as child-friendly distraction, monitoring Maisy's healing through pictures drawn in crayon. The network's dismantling had prompted policy changes at school districts throughout Oregon, new protocols for visitor verification and staff background checks, legislation drafted in response to failures that had nearly cost Sarah Kemper her life. Maisy's name appeared in none of the official documents, protected by juvenile privacy laws and careful legal maneuvering. Jarrick had tracked these developments through his usual channels, ensuring that loose ends remained tied, that accomplices still at large received appropriate attention from people who operated outside legal constraints. Some monsters required courtrooms and due process. Others simply needed to disappear in ways that deterred copycats. Philip Thorne had vanished from his registered addresses within 48 hours of Ashford's arrest, abandoning vehicles and properties with speed that suggested pre-planned contingencies for network compromise. Federal warrants carried no weight against someone who'd dissolved into underground channels, where cash and false identities replaced legal existence. But Jarrick's resources extended into spaces where badges couldn't follow, where information flowed through veins of commerce both legitimate and otherwise, and certain questions received answers regardless of how deeply targets tried to hide. The other names connected to the network had experienced varied fates. 2 arrested in coordinated raids, 1 found dead in circumstances ruled suicide, despite inconsistencies that made detectives exchange meaningful glances. Another simply gone as if erased from existence entirely. Morrison hadn't asked questions about the pattern, recognizing efficiency that exceeded coincidence while maintaining plausible deniability that protected her career from complications. Justice wore many faces, and she'd learned to accept victories, even when their mechanisms remained diplomatically obscure. Maisy's testimony had been recorded through specialized interview protocols designed to extract truth without re-traumatizing young witnesses, child psychologists guiding her through recollections that would form prosecution's foundation. Her words had been clear and consistent, details corroborating physical evidence in ways that made defense attorneys' jobs nearly impossible. The district attorney had privately thanked Morrison for delivering a case so thoroughly documented that plea bargains became inevitable, saving the girl from having to testify in open court. St. Cecilia Academy had implemented new security measures that transformed the campus into something approaching fortress, parent committees demanding changes that administration rushed to provide before liability lawyers could calculate potential damages. Maisy had transferred to a different school at Lucina's request. Fresh start, an environment not haunted by memories of silver Lexuses and candy offered by men who watched through chain-link fences. Her new teachers had been briefed only on educational needs, spared details of why this particular student sometimes flinched at unexpected sounds or avoided certain vehicle colors in parking lots. On a Thursday evening 4 weeks after their first meeting, Lucina found herself walking past La Villora on her way home from work, the restaurant glowing amber in the autumn darkness. She paused outside, staring through windows that revealed elegant worlds she'd only glimpsed while cleaning houses where people lived differently than she did. Jarrick sat at his corner table, alone as always, wineglass catching light while he read something on his phone with expression that revealed nothing. He looked up as if sensing observation, eyes finding hers through glass and distance with uncanny precision that made her breath catch. He raised his glass slightly in acknowledgement or invitation, gesture small enough to be deniable, yet significant enough to communicate intention. She stood frozen for 3 heartbeats, feeling Maisy's hand in hers. The girl had insisted on accompanying her tonight, some intuition beyond her years guiding them to this moment. Lucina pushed open the door, Portland's cool air following them inside as they crossed threshold into warmth and amber light, and possibilities neither would have imagined a month earlier. The maitre d' started to intercept before recognizing them, his expression shifting into something approaching respect as he stepped aside. They reached Jarrick's table and he stood, gesture of courtesy that seemed more significant coming from someone who typically made others come to him. Maisy looked up at him with eyes that had learned to distinguish between types of power, understanding that scary and dangerous weren't always the same as bad. "He's not coming back, right?" she asked, the question she'd been carrying for weeks finally finding voice in presence of someone whose answer she'd believe. Her hand tightened in her mother's, needing confirmation from authority that commanded truth through something beyond mere reassurance. Jarrick crouched to her eye level, bringing himself down to meet her rather than forcing her to crane upward, showing respect through posture that most adults never considered. His expression carried weight of absolute certainty, promise that wasn't empty comfort, but verified fact. "No," he said simply, holding her gaze with intensity that sealed the statement like blood oath or signed contract. Some monsters don't come back, and the ones who try to wake up find out that some people don't sleep at all, specifically so children can. The answer satisfied something in her that platitudes couldn't have reached, addressing both immediate fear and larger understanding about how safety actually worked in imperfect worlds. She nodded once, accepting his words with gravity that suggested she understood their full weight. Behind them, the piano resumed its melody, something classical and measured that filled spaces between conversation with elegant noise. Outside, Portland's evening sky had turned the color of burnished copper, light reflecting off the Willamette, until the river seemed to carry fire downstream toward the Pacific. Thank you all for following this story. If you enjoyed it, write in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know what corner of the world connected with Maisy's courage and Jarrick's silent protection. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video, because your support is what keeps these stories coming. Every view, every comment, every share helps me continue bringing you tales of ordinary people finding extraordinary strength when it matters most.